Next from Springfield, we sit down with Gary Niemeyer, past president of the Illinois Corn Growers Association. Mr. Niemeyer discusses what progress has been made on Illinois' outdated lock and dam system, the future of Illinois farming, and how technological advances have impacted the farming industry. This runs about 30 minutes.
Gary Niemeyer, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois channel. It's been a little bit of time since we visited with you, and we wanted, as we sit here and we're coming up slowly for everyone, I'm sure, this spring. It seems like winter never wants to release its cold grip on us all. But it won't be too long, and I would hope that the farmers are able to get back in the field. So we wanted to touch base with you on where are we on agriculture relative to Illinois? And to remind our viewers that agriculture is the largest industry in Illinois, even though relatively few people are engaged in it on a population standpoint, actually on the farm. But as we enter the growing season for 2014, what are some of the big things that are on your radar?
Well, you know, Terry, I know that your audience is not just farmers, because we're only 1% of the population. Believe it or not, 1 out of every 12 people in this country, and especially in the state of Illinois, is involved in agriculture in one way, shape, or form, whether it's transportation, producing fertilizer and delivering it, diesel fuel. It doesn't matter. And the other side of it is 50% of the crops that we grow in this state, both corn and soybeans, are exported. So getting back into the export markets after this disastrous 2012 drought that we had is very important to all of us in agriculture. Obviously, if you would have been able to look outside just a little while ago, we would have seen a snowstorm on March 25th. Yes, everybody is tired of winter. We're ready to get back on the farm and get going again. And there's a lot of people sitting around very itchy to do that.
For us non-farmers, when would you normally go in to start planting?
Normally, we start right around the 10th of April to the 15th, somewhere around the middle of April. Every year is different. Gee, I was thinking back in 2012, we planted, I think all the corn was planted in the month of March. That's unusual. Last year, 2013, we didn't even start planting until May 22nd. May 22nd. That was just phenomenally late.
Well, it was a very wet spring, so you couldn't get in the field then.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of changing weather patterns that we have to learn how to deal with. And
how did that impact the harvest?
You know, this is the strangest year I've ever seen.
2013.
2013, well, 2012 was too, but 2013 especially. Everybody's ready to go to the field. This time last year, it just kept raining and raining and raining, and we couldn't get in. And normally, if you follow any statistics from any, like the University of Illinois, for example, after the 10th of May, you normally lose 1 bushel per day of not planting. And when you get up to about the 10th of June, then you could expect that your yields will be half of what they normally were. But because of the way the weather turned out, and it stayed relatively cool, and we had a very good growing season, the corn actually, we had the largest crop we've ever had last year. So,
did that teach you anything as a farmer, not just individually, but did you talk to other farmers to say, was that a learning experience?
Oh.
Because you probably wouldn't have imagined that, right?
No, we really didn't. And you know, we've talked about pricing your grain. How do you price your grain? How do you know to price your grain? You know, from history, you know, well, gee, this may not necessarily work very good to price a lot of corn early, but that was the thing you should have done last year, because we ended up having this phenomenal crop. And even just before we harvested it, I was stunned because I did not expect to see the kind of crop that came out, and I think most farmers didn't. That's the reason the price of corn dropped off virtually 40% from spring planting to harvest last year.
There's 2 things that I wanted to talk about. One thing, I often find it fascinating when we talk about the economy of Illinois, how many people don't really appreciate the extent to which the economy of Illinois is integrated into the world markets. I often tell people, think of Illinois more as a nation and you have a better idea of what we do. Relative to, you know, we have things happening like we see here recently with Ukraine, and I don't know if Illinois corn goes to Ukraine per se, but to what extent are Illinois crops increasingly being bought around the world? How's Illinois agriculture doing, I guess, as relative to exports?
Well, I can tell you the soybeans are just dynamite. They have grown exponentially straight up practically since China especially started taking soybeans. And recently, because they can't get enough soybean meal, they've had to use DDGs, digestible dry grain solubles. That's a product that comes out of the ethanol process, and they've been growing dramatically as well because it's a feed source for a lot of Chinese livestock, especially pork and beef.
So I guess slowly the Asian diet is changing somewhat more to the Western, where they're having more meat and growing
Absolutely.
more cattle and livestock, so they need to feed.
Exactly. And most of all our crops, corn, soybeans, both are fed to livestock. Only 8% of the corn that we grow in this country goes to human foods, such as corn oil, cornmeal. It's not sweet corn. Sweet corn's a vegetable. It's totally different. So we want to make sure we get that separated. But when you look at the amount of grain, 95% of the world's population lives outside of the United States. And it only behooves us to export our grain overseas. When we do that, we have a lot of, the amount of money that we bring in reduces our amount of expenditures overseas, so that we gain every time we sell more crops overseas. And when we bring that money back here to the state of Illinois especially, it's very helpful in reducing our deficit.
You know, relative to that, a lot of, well, I guess maybe all of the grain, I don't know what percent, but a high percent of our grain goes down the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans for export around the world, as you mentioning. I guess for China goes through the Panama Canal and over to them. But we have talked before, and I want to get an update. The locks and dams on the Mississippi are crumbling. They need to be rebuilt. I think some of them were built back in the 1920s. They're past their life cycle. What success has the farming community had relative to getting funds from the U.S. Congress to rebuild those locks and dams?
We're working on that right now. We're about to pass a Water Resources Development Act. Let me give you a little history about this. Normally, we would have a water bill every other year in the even years. 1998, 2000. Well, 2000 was the last one we had.
Why did it stop happening on that?
Politics, I guess I could say. Lack of money available to utilize on our inland waterway system. And it went till 2007 before we've had our last water bill, and from 2007 till 2014 for our next one. Now I think they're going to try to get back into that process. But Terry, I happened to have the opportunity to be with the Army Corps of Engineers General out in Washington, D.C., and he was showing how much interest there is from our country in moving grain overseas. Would you believe that China is spending somewhere around $36 billion a year to grow their infrastructure system? And that's not just locks and dams, it's railroads and roads and everything else. Brazil spending billion, I gotta use the big B word, 27 billion a year to upgrade their infrastructure system. And all we have designated in the United States for upgrading our inland waterway system is $2 billion. $2 billion.
What would it cost to rebuild it?
Well, it costs substantially more than that. Probably, I would say somewhere if we were to rebuild the whole thing, we're probably in the $20 to $30 billion range.
I'm going to say something that probably people might find hard to believe, but to me, what people don't realize is that the U.S. federal budget is now in the neighborhood of $4 trillion, which is 4,000 billion. So when you're talking about 20 billion, it's like saying if you had $4,000, would we want to rebuild our waterways for $20?
Yeah. You know, I probably answered you a little too quick because I just happened to remember. You remember a couple of years ago when we were going to use these shovel-ready projects?
Right.
We wondered where we fit in with upgrading our system. And I do remember after you asked the question, I asked, so exactly how many shovel-ready projects does the Army Corps of Engineers, it's kind of like an unfunded mandate, really have on the books? It was $61 billion at that time. So that's a more realistic number. I was thinking more along the how much it would cost to upgrade the Illinois and Mississippi River system.
Right, and I kind of thought that you were focusing on that because of the nature of my question. But if we don't fund and rebuild those waterways, the locks and dams on our rivers, what's going to happen relative to how long will we be able to move our grain through them?
Well, as you started out, these systems were built 80 years ago to last 50.
To last 50 years?
Yeah. So we're already 20 to 30 years behind the 8 ball. And had we not, in this specific water bill that's coming out, there was Olmsted Lock and Dam that was sucking a lot of the money out of the projects. And Congress at least understood that out of our Inland Waterway Trust Fund. The Inland Waterway Trust Fund is how we put money into this system. It's a 20-cent barge diesel tax fee. And we have been encouraging Congress to up that more to almost 26 to 29 cents so that we can, because we have to pay for half of the inland waterway system.
It's kind of a user fee.
It's a user fee, absolutely. And we're not against that because, you know, if we don't do something, if we hadn't have had these, the government come in, and I think it's going to be probably end up being an 85-15 split where they only take 15% out of our Inland Waterway Trust Fund to finish the Olmsted Lock, it would have been 2070 before we would have gotten any of the locks and dams in Illinois and on the Mississippi, and that's just the first 7 started.
How long would it take roughly to rebuild? Once you got the funding, how long would it take to build some of this?
Well, Jim and Ellie,
I know you're not an engineer.
just think back in the 1920s and 30s, and they built the whole lock system in I think 8 years. And they
didn't have the gear.
They didn't have any kind of technology like we have right now.
Quickly, I would also say I know Panama. Of course, the famous Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is being rebuilt right now. Speaking of what other countries are doing, is being rebuilt right now by the Panamanians, and partially because, since it was built in 1903, when Teddy Roosevelt was president. You know, obviously ships have gotten bigger, and so the ability to move larger ships through there is limited. So they're expanding the locks and dams as far as the length. Do we need to expand when we rebuild the length of the locks and dams on the Mississippi?
That's a good question, and the answer to that is no. We are maxed out. And the reason is, if you ever have the opportunity to go down the Mississippi or the Illinois rivers, there are a lot of bends in the river, and a 15-barge tow that's 5 long and 3 wide with the towboat behind it is the maximum length that we can have. So the 1,200-foot lock would allow that boat to go through without having to break in two. And a lot of time, it's pretty dangerous to break tows in two. So we are pretty much where we're going to be.
You know, there's always 1,000 questions we could ask. I'm going to try to see if we can go through some relatively quickly, but still touch on them. One of the issues that always is impacting really every industry these days is environmental issues. And relative to farming, you have a variety of chemicals you're putting on the ground. You're always looking at how to change that for environmental reasons, I would imagine, but also just so you're not wasting your money by putting chemicals on the ground that maybe aren't doing what they should do or wash off. So let's talk what's happening in the world of farming, the environment, and to what extent are there any new regulations on farmers that we should know about?
You know, it's a good question. Quite honestly, we started several years ago with Roundup, and prior to that, we put like a quart of a product in the ground.
Now let me just insert.
I'm sorry.
Most people may know what Roundup is, but maybe they don't. I mean,
Roundup,
sometimes you put it on your lawn, or I'll put it on my driveway to get the grass out of the cracks. But why does a farmer use Roundup? What does it do?
Because it's a contact killer. It does not get into the soil. It attaches to the plant itself.
So it's designed to kill weeds and things.
Right. And we have Roundup Ready resistant corn and soybean products, so it just attacks the weed, and it has a lot less potential to get into the water system. This is very high technological advanced technology that we have utilized for the last probably 5 or 10 years, and we're having to we have some weeds that are starting to become resistant to it, so we have to bring some new products on. Enlist is one that just comes to mind, and it adds 2,4-D to that mix. But for some reason, we have had a real big slowdown at USDA in approval of products such as MIR 162, and that's when we move a product overseas, it slows the process down, and if you've been watching the news lately, China has backed off on a lot of their pre-ordered corn because they found some of these chemicals in it. Well, we need to get these processes moved on an international basis in a much more quick fashion. And ironically, if a chemical company creates a brand new product that is so efficient, it not only is utilized in production of grain here in the United States, it's used in Argentina and Brazil. Kind of interesting how those products can be approved in those two countries much quicker than they are here. And we've really slowed down probably twice as long to get a product through the approval process. And that's still
Do we
after.
know why that is? You know, there was a story just the other day on suntan, sunscreens, I should say, and how there are more effective sunscreens being utilized in Europe and other countries, but the FDA hasn't approved them here.
Yeah.
There seems to be a real lag in the regulatory agencies as far as getting things approved or unapproved, and so we often find, as you just mentioned, that we have these products available overseas but not within the United States.
So what's really happened is an EIS, Environmental Impact Study, they've been doing twice as many or 3 times as many of these, which delays the product and increases the cost, you know, for us to have a product on the market. If you think about it, a new concept that comes into agriculture is introduced into the experimental stage. It still takes practically 8 years and several $100 million to get that product from the experimental stage passed through USDA and FDA, and to make sure it's a safe product. Now they're adding another tier of environmental safety to this. All it does is just increase the cost. But you know, you look at the price of fuel, you look at the price of grain, you look at the price of most anything you're using, they've all increased dramatically.
Let me ask this, if the farmers in Brazil are using it and farmers in other countries, to what extent is that going to put American farmers at a competitive disadvantage?
Yes, the answer is yes. And the same way happened even with Roundup a few years back. There was a lot of Roundup ready products being shipped to Copenhagen.
You know, the good thing, and I want to kind of frame this a little bit just for people, you know, we live here in the United States has been the way it has been for years, but what's happening relative to the last 25, 30 years, we have a number of countries that didn't have a middle class, such as China, such as India, Brazil, developing, which is a good thing. Even Russia, which you know, it's been 20 years now since the Soviet Union imploded, so that they see on television the lifestyle that Americans have had through television and movies, and they are clamoring for the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it's somewhat of a phenomenon of this period in time, that therefore we should have these markets available, but it also means that we're in greater competition around the world vis-a-vis agriculture, just as the time there's more growing demand for, as we mentioned, China, to have beef and pork and all in their diet as well. You're competing with the Brazilian farms. In fact, I don't know to what extent I've seen some farmers from the United States going down and expanding their operations in Brazil because it's less regulation. The land, I think, is cheaper. The labor is cheaper.
Let me see if I can put this in perspective of the question you're asking. Before any product is approved for any distribution, even in any other country, it has to pass our FDA, and it does. Then we have, USDA has been kind of slowly putting the throttle back on us. Now these are unfunded mandates in my estimation, and the Illinois Corn Growers about 3 years ago did a study just exactly how much is the untold cost to you as a farmer, and they used 1,100 acre, that's an average farm in the state of Illinois, as an example. You realize that cost was $36,000 per 1,100 acre farm, an excessive amount of regulations. These continue to add up, and it slows down the profitability, and it increases the price. I've heard a lot of environmental groups say, well, we'd like to run the price of gasoline up to $6 a gallon, and then you wouldn't use it, and then it would keep the environment clean. Maybe I'll understand that logic someday.
You know, I mean, I understand, and you understand it. I mean, no one wants to have some chemical put on the food supply that's going to all of a sudden be causing some
Terry,
problems.
I live here on this farm. We put the chemicals on this ground. My mom and my dad lived on the same place. They were both 91 when they passed away, and I would encourage everybody to work as hard as they do and eat the food, because we have a garden out here in the back that we grow right here on our own farm. We drink the water out of the well. It's a little excessive amount of concern, I think.
You know, another issue, and again, we could delve into any one of these issues that we were just touching on, and you could spend a whole hour on that, I know, but just to kind of skip along some of the issues I want to get in. One of the interesting aspects, we sit here at this point in time in 2014 as a society often talking about the unemployment rate, and for good reasons. And yet one of the issues that we don't talk about and is really coming at us as a society is the retirement of the baby boom generation. So we have all kinds of people, teachers, engineers, and farmers who are aging.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean, Terry. It's dawned upon me.
I wanted to ask, to what extent, when we talk about one of the issues is sustainability, we hear that as a phrase, but I'm wondering to what extent is American agriculture going to be sustainable relative to having family farms, relative to having new people coming on the farms. When you talk about 1,100 acres as an average farm at $15,000 an acre for just to buy the land, you're looking at $1.5 million just for the land. I think a combine, you had told me, can run, it depends like a car,
$300,000 to $400,000.
$400,000. So, I mean, this is going to cost you, what, $2 to $3 million just to get into the game, and how many young farmers are going to be able to get their hands on $2 to $3 million?
That's a really good question. So far, it's been just family farmers throughout the generations, the young boys and girls. I have to admit, I have really seen a lot of young ladies come back and be involved on their own farm, and I think that is fantastic. I'm happy to see that. But it's next to impossible to get into this business, and that's the reason you see the farms expanding into larger and larger sizes. Around here, I think the largest farm in this county is close to 69,000 acres. That's huge when you figure the average average farm size is about 1,100 to 1,200 acres. I think 900 if I wanted to back to Sangamon County and USDA's figures.
Let me insert, or have you insert, what is the average age of a farmer now?
57 is what we've been told. But that means that half of them are over 57. I'm 65. I'm still farming. I enjoy it. I mean, I probably wouldn't know what to do if I didn't farm. But
on the other hand, no one's going to live forever. And
no.
Are we going to, look, the land's not going to go away. I guess the question is, ultimately, are we still going to have the family farm? Or is it all going to be ultimately bought out by corporations and farmed as corporate farms?
You know, that's really a very interesting question. We've had a lot of discussion at that, even at our local coffee shops. If the family...
And the other thing put in your answer is, does it matter?
The family farm, sure, they could be a sub-S corporation, but for the most part, it's family operated and family owned. I don't necessarily see just yet corporate farms like Monsanto starting to farm. I don't see that happening, but at some point in the future, maybe it will. You know, if you go back in the 1950s and 60s, maybe 40s and 50s would be more closer, 50% of the population in this state were farmers, really. And now it's about 1.5%. So because of new technology, because of machinery, because of all these things that we have had the opportunity to be given and helped us to get to the point where we are, even chemicals and seed corn, those are new technologies as well. We have been able to utilize substitute capital for labor. But at what point and what time will that end? I don't know. That's a good question.
And as let's just throw a little bit on sustainability, just from a different standpoint. One of the issues we often hear, and it has to do with, again, in the environmental context, when we talk about sustainability in that context, what are we talking about?
Well, sustainability is continuing to do what you have done at a profitable level, and I want to make sure the word profitable level is in there, because if it's not, you're not sustainable,
you have to
realistically.
Be economically sustainable.
Exactly. Some of the things that maybe our governments do is not necessarily sustainable, but so far we've been very fortunate because we've had technology. If you look at the yield curve on corn, on soybeans, it doesn't matter, they're both about the same. They have been increasing, but just recently they've been increasing at a more dramatic rate because of biotechnology. The essence of biotechnology is just the reason why we've been able to continue to grow. And not only just in seed, but in machinery. I just purchased a new planter. It's amazing. There's a little motor about that size that runs the population and singulates the grain. And we can go faster than we do with our current planters. We don't have chains driving stuff. It's all technological, GPS. It's amazing.
Yeah, I was going to say, so right now, that was one thing I was going to ask, and again, not to have too long of a conversation on it, but how has technology, all of us now have GPS in our phones. We know in our own lives that we no longer are driving with that paper map in our hand trying to figure out. We got something telling us turn right 100 yards. How has GPS changed farming?
Oh, Giovanelli, so dramatically. First of all, I got to thank my 8-year-old granddaughter who has taught me how to use my smartphone. I wasn't very smart at how to use that. But this technology is amazing. We adopted one piece of technology on our planter, and to do what we did was it automatically shut off anytime we crossed over where we had recently planted. That technology cost me $13,000 the first year we put it on a planter. I paid for it in a year and a half. When you figure the price of a bag of seed corn is $300 to $400 and seed beans are $50 to $100 a bag, and you save that amount of seed, the technology does work. But it's just phenomenal. It's come along all at once.
That's a heck of a rate of return.
That is huge. And that's the reason we have been able to continue to grow and be sustainable. And we've cut back. Our land use, we're using 37% less land to produce the same amount of corn. And my nitrogen, when I went to the University of Illinois back in the 70s, we used 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn. We're down to 0.86 this last year with the phenomenal yields we've had.
Is that because of GPS or what?
That and the technology of planting the corn thicker, the singulation so it's evenly spaced, the new root mass system that takes up more nitrogen and fertilizers and chemicals. It's just phenomenal, the ability we've had to do this. And it's surprising to me that everybody wants to stop us from being progressive, in the sense that we are going,
When you say everyone wants to stop us, you mean the government is?
Well, a lot of excess regulations. I really don't grasp the logic of these excess regulations. I guess when you're an elected official, you have to pass some kind of legislation that says that what you're doing is important, but I'm not so sure it's really sustainable what they continue to do in a certain aspect. Now, there's safety. I am not against safety. We go out of our way. We spend a tremendous amount of time on farm safety, and we have lights on our planter. Gee, it looks like a Christmas tree going down the road, encouraging people to slow down. We're not unsafe. We don't put chemicals on that would do harm to our water. We don't throw money away.
So the average farmer is going to have in the neighborhood of $1.5 million. He doesn't want to be spoiling his investment by putting chemicals on there that's going to turn his land into
Exactly.
an EPA brownfield.
We don't do those kind of things. It's economically not viable to do it, and it doesn't make any sense, and we don't. And the other question is, I think if people that don't understand agriculture were to understand the amount of risk that we take in a year's time, if we go out and borrow $500,000 to $1 million and put a crop in the ground, and then we bring that crop out of the ground, you know, how do you make money on that? It's not a government grant. This is borrowing money. You have to pay that back each and every year. Believe you me, they're on us like, that's the reason we have to have good, sound crop insurance policies. That's the reason we have to have a good farm bill, that we know where we're going and be prepared, and have markets that can grow. And that's the other thing we talked about earlier. Our government is not interested, you know, they talk about, oh, we need to increase the amount of unemployment. Really? Well, start building a lock and dam system. I'm sure that you could create a lot of growth. Not only that, but in the restaurants, the people who would come in, building up, you know, all the things that need to go in, the lumber, the concrete, creating jobs. It's here, it's available, we can do it.
All right, Gary Niemeyer, thanks for joining us.
You're quite welcome.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.